and welcome to this session on recommendations for the sustainability of journalism. My name is Rasmus Kleist Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. I also have the honor of chairing the working group on the sustainability of journalism of the Forum of Information and Democracy. And we are honored to have this opportunity to be part of the UNESCO World Press Freedom Conference to talk about some of the ideas that we are discussing in the group and with people from around the world on what can be done to enhance the sustainability of journalism globally. Independent professional journalism, with its many imperfections, is important for our societies. It helps people be more informed, it helps people participate in political processes and engage with their local communities. At its best, it can hold power to account and ensure scrutiny of both private and public power and how it's exercised during the pandemic, but also, of course, before and after the crisis. The problems are well known. It can be unequal, it can be prejudiced, it can reinforce existing inequalities, but it's a real public value to have independent professional journalism in our societies, and reams of research support this. However, today, the funding of this independent professional journalism is under immense pressure. We've moved to a digital, mobile, and platform-dominated media environment where traditional news organizations capture only a small share of audience's attention and only a small share of an advertising market, as people increasingly turn to digital outlets and especially to big platform companies such as Google and Facebook that capture a very large share of attention in advertising, challenging the traditional funding models of independent professional journalism. Part of the challenge, however, is also that the regulatory environment that we work in hasn't always kept pace with changes on the ground. So in the group, we're looking both at things that journalists and media organizations can do to develop new ways of doing their work and funding their work, but also at the possibility that governments, at least those governments that actually respect free expression and media freedom, might have a role in creating a more enabling environment so that we can have new forms of journalism and better forms of journalism that are economically sustainable in the future. And in the working group, we are approaching this on the basis of essentially 3 principles. We're looking at future-oriented responses that are not about romanticizing the past or propping up incumbent businesses, but about thinking about what it means for professional journalism to be able to thrive and do its work also in the future. We're looking for recommendations that are evidence-based or have proof of concept. It's important to speculate about other possible worlds, but it's also important sometimes to consider the tools we actually have and that we have reason to believe will work. And finally, we're looking for recommendations that might have relatively broad political and public support, because clearly one of the challenges for journalism around the world today is political attacks from powerful people who are trying to exploit the fact that much of the public is skeptical of journalism. And there is a risk sometimes that journalism will become even further politicized and polarizing than it already is, further weakening the connection with the public that it aims to serve. Now, I'm pleased to have with me today some of the eminent people who are involved in our work in the working group, as well as very privileged to have both Nika Dat and Henrik Erdel from the Forum on Information and Democracy itself to position our work in the wider work of the forum itself. So we will discuss some of the ideas that members of the group have, but before we dive into that conversation, I want to hand it over here to Nika to position our work in the context of the wider work that the forum is doing.
Thank you, Rasmus. The sustainability of journalism indeed a major threat to public debate and democracy. And it is at the core of the international initiative on information and democracy we launched 2 years ago with Reporters Without Borders. And I'm so pleased to see that the principles we have outlined together with Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, Maria Ressa, and so many brilliant minds are being turned into concrete recommendations by the Forum on Information and Democracy with your help and the amazing steering committee you are chairing. In our International Declaration on Information and Democracy, we have defined the social function of journalism as a trusted third party for societies and individuals. It allows for the establishment of checks and balances and empowers people to fully participate in society. Journalism aims to give account of reality, to reveal it in the broadest, deepest, and most relevant manner possible. giving it permission for the exercise of the right to freedom of opinion. So we believe that this social function justifies an effort by societies to ensure its financial sustainability. This is the sense of the commitment of the 42 signatory states of the International Partnership on Information and Democracy, an international agreement based on our declaration. But principles and commitments are not enough. And we at Forum acknowledges that. With the complexity of the challenges facing the information and communication spaces, we needed this international group of experts to facilitate actual policy changes. The forum is this link between international principles and concrete policy changes at the national level. So our first report covered 4 structural issues to put an end to the information chaos. As much as we truly need to find concrete solutions to address the harms of disinformation and misinformation, we also need to make sure our immune system journalism is strong enough. So having said that, I'm handing back it to you.
Thank you so much, Nighat, and for all your work in sharing the forum's overall efforts. We're going to turn first to the question of the sustainability of journalism. And I'll invite first a couple of our participants today to give a brief intro to that issue, and then we'll have a brief conversation around that before we move on to wider issues. But first, I'll turn to Julia Cachet, who's a professor of economics at Sciences Po, Paris in France, and a member of the steering group on the sustainability of journalism. So Julia, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rasmus. I think the first key thing to highlight that might seem obvious, but that is always very important to remind, is the fact that we cannot have a living democracy without information. And I think it's why the title of this working group was of particular importance. And I also think, and we all agree on that in the group, that is why we cannot consider information as a normal good, but we should consider information as a public good. And in a sense, information for all the citizens above a certain age is as important as education is for younger citizens. I think the key thing is that in a well-working democracy, when people go and vote, they need to be informed. If they are not informed, their vote is captured, and the quality of the democratic debate suffer from that. Now, one of the key issue and key difficulty is the fact that information is a public good, but we cannot only have public media. It's important to have public media, and it's important to have independent public broadcasters. And one thing I want to highlight with respect to what has been done in recent years, for example, by Twitter, is that public broadcasters does not mean broadcasters that are controlled by the government. You can be like public media and an independent media. You also can be a public media and a captured media. But the truth, and this is part of the issue we faced in this group, is that you can be a private media and a captured media, because the other big issue is the question of the ownership of the media, who owns the media, and what do we do to guarantee the independence of the journalist. And I think this issue has 2 different aspects. The first one is really the one of the relationship between the journalists themselves and their owners, and what are the rules that we need to put in place to guarantee the independence of the journalistic work, even in the case where we have some billionaires owning the media. And what we see around the world and in Western democracies is more and more billionaires buying media outlets. But the second key issue, and I think this was even more important this year at the time of the pandemic, is that we also need to take into account the citizens themselves. And one of the things that is key is to build a confidence link between the citizen and the journalist and the media outlets. If we look at all the studies that are done every year, but Rasmus knows that even better than me, with all the work of the Reuters Institute, what we see is from one year to the other, the confidence in the media that is collapsing everywhere, which is partly linked to the ownership structure, and it means that we have not yet solved all the issue of the governance of the media outlets to guarantee the independence of journalists for a given market structure.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'll turn next to Elizabeth Hansen, who's a senior research fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at the Columbia Journalism School in the US, where I suppose the idea of public service broadcasting may seem as speculative and counterfactual as the idea of public healthcare. But Elizabeth, you have your own research and ideas on how we might approach these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Rasmus, and thanks to all of you for being here. I want to add to what Julia shared with a perspective of kind of hope and optimism, and share a bit what I'm seeing on the US scene. I think, you know, we've seen philanthropic individuals and institutions really stepping up in the last 5 years in support of local journalism, in support of single subject journalism. And I think that's, you know, that's a really important piece of the sustainability puzzle, and I think that's positive. But I think what we're seeing in our discussions in the working group and out there in the field is that philanthropy alone can't solve these problems, and that in fact we do need robust policy interventions at the rulemaking and structural level to kind of set all of these entities on new footing. And I think that's supported at a kind of like practice entity level by newsrooms that are really starting to experiment with diversifying their revenue, with you know, finding reader revenue, philanthropic support, advertising. And so I think that experimentation and diversification at the entity level is really a promising kind of force for good for independence, because it says to me that, you know, these entities really want structures that promote independence. And so what's been really exciting in these discussions with the working group is to kind of survey the landscape of policy interventions and to really think about both kind of direct and indirect subsidies for journalism that really set all of these entities on new footing. And to Julia's point, I think this, you know, these issues of ownership and independence are really, really critical. And it's been exciting, I think, and will be important as these policy recommendations become public, to really advance that conversation about how all of these interventions can promote independence. But overall, you know, I think we have the tools, we have the frameworks, we have the know-how, everything is there. I really think what we need is mobilization and collective action, both, you know, kind of domestically and across borders, to really push forward and implement what we know works. So thank you.
Elizabeth, I mean, it's, I think, incredibly important to hold on to what you said about hope and optimism, and to remember that even in a time characterized by a little less than a war on journalism by many powerful actors, that we are seeing journalists and media organizations and others taking their future into their own hands. And we'll turn later to Tanya and Steely, who I think are some of the most impressive examples of this from around the world. But before we turn to how people are making themselves captains of their own destiny, I wanted to turn to Henrik Wordal, who's also a board member of the Forum of Information and Democracy and director of the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, to provide his perspective. Henrik.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. And first of all, thank you for both the invitation to join the panel, and thanks a lot to the working group on the sustainability of journalism for having produced such a comprehensive and important report addressing, in my view, one of the really pressing issues of our time. And I'm coming to this discussion not as a media observer or analyst, nor as a journalist, but as a peace researcher representing the large research community studying the broader societal implications of declining democracy. And it's within the domain of media freedom that we're now seeing the most broad-scale attack on democratic freedoms right now. Peace and political stability is intrinsically linked to democracy and good governance. Press freedom and independent journalism are integral parts of a thriving democracy, providing for transparency and accountability. Press freedom is directly associated with improved prospects for peace, respect for human rights, and increased opportunities for trust building across communities. And the report initially states that independent journalism faces a crisis that is historic in its proportions. That is a strong claim. But I also believe that it is an accurate claim. The most comprehensive global democracy data collection effort, the Varieties of Democracies, or VDEM project, recently released their 2020 report on the state of democratic freedom in the world, and then concluded that the global decline during the past 10 years is steep, and that it continues in 2020, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. And overall, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2020 is now down to levels last found around 1990. So we're at a 30-year low point in terms of democracy. As I said, it is within the category of freedom of expression and independence of media that we're seeing the most broad-scale attack on democratic freedoms. Freedom of expression and media freedom is in substantial decline in 32 countries compared to only 19 countries just 3 years ago. And according to VDEM, of the 10 most rapidly declining indicators of democracy overall, 8 are in the domain of freedom of expression and the media. And among the most significant are government censorship of the media self-censorship, freedom of discussion for women, harassment of journalists, and media bias. And this development calls for action, and I'm grateful to the working group for having provided such an important basis for that call. So thank you very much. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Henrik. I mean, I know we've built in a little bit of time for discussion of recommendations, but I mean, I suppose it's particularly important here that we are able to connect the analytical observations that scholars can make with the fierce urgency of the situation on the ground. So with the tacit permission, or at least acquiescence of the group, I'd like to move on now to some observations from people who are really at the forefront of figuring these things out in practice in news organizations around the world. And I'll turn first to Stilly, who is a member of the steering group on the working group on sustainability of journalism, as well as the co-founder and CEO of the Daily Maverick in South Africa, to talk about his practical work at making the path by walking in South Africa. Stilly, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rasmus. And yeah, amazing to be part of this panel today and to talk about our experiences. I think the problems that we face as an industry are really a multi-headed hydra. And I think the committee has really tried to delve into all those different topics that make this such a big environmental task. It's not just one thing that needs to be solved. We need to look at so many different areas, from regulation, government involvement, the business community, the public. How do we address each of those challenges, as well as the talent issue that we have in the industry following this great period of disruption that has affected media outlets all over the world. If I look at our journey of the last 11 and a half years of trying to get a public service mandated media organization off the ground, and the challenges we had around raising funding, convincing people to join a membership program and to financially support independent and investigative journalism, the threats that we've faced directly, that our journalists face, that we've faced through legal threats and challenges, the lack of support from the business community in all of this, and how the political environment has played out, and the pressures which are not as explicit in our country as they are in other countries. We rank quite highly on the Press Freedom Index, but we are in other ways challenged by less explicit ways in which government interference and influence can be peddled. And so it really is quite a complex system and quite a range of topics and challenges that need to be addressed. And then on top of that, an industry that has lost half of its skilled workforce in the last decade. And how do we address these really huge challenges when people are leaving the industry, when experienced people are taking better paying jobs for less risk, and how we're upgrading and improving our skills as leaders in this industry to be taking on building cultures of innovation within our organization, so that we're continuously fulfilling our public service mandates, putting out new products that are audience-centric and that deliver on creating value to the people that we claim to serve. So for us, it was a really interesting experience to be part of this working group, to see how we could try and address all of those across many different countries, across many different media types, and across many different visions and the challenges of each political environment.
Thanks very much, Steely. I mean, Tanya, you have a different experience of some of these issues than I think many journalists from more privileged parts of the world, and perhaps some resonances with the experience that Steely talks about from South Africa. So I'll turn to you next, also a member of the steering committee and deputy editorial director in the Mexican media group, Editorial Animal.
Hi, thank you for having me. Yes, I think that it's very important to start thinking in the attacks against press freedom in a very open level, I think. I mean, I think a lot of people, it's like they think that, for example, killing a journalist, it's the way of attacks against press freedom. Of course it is. I mean, I'm from Mexico, one of the countries more dangerous to be a journalist. But the role that the government have in these attacks, it's not only, of course, investigating those attacks, but also there are different ways in which the governments are acting against press freedom that are not maybe so direct as killing as journalists. For example, we don't know sometimes how public resources are used in media. Public resources used on media to press media, to censor media, or to buy, to buy media that are desperate to have resources to operate. This use of public resources in a lot of countries is a really problem, and it's part of what government are doing to control the press, and they are not saying it. They are not being clear about it. We also have, for example, it's very common to have audit operations from government to media to press their job, like maybe if you are a very small media, if you have a very huge audit from government, it's almost impossible to sustain that. And maybe it's not a very direct attack, but it is, because it affects your operation and you need to invest in this audit instead of investing on journalism. Of course, we also have, for example, that in the media itself, for example, they have terrible conditions for journalists. They are paying bad, they are not providing social security. And sometimes this is possible because the law itself permits that, and their government, they are not doing that in order to change this. And to have these big media, these huge conglomerates of media, to be responsible with their journalists. So I think that there is, for example, the public speech, of course, from government disqualifying the media, this discourse saying that fake news, it's a media that it's critic, that investigates. Of course, it's also part of this huge problem. So what I'm trying to say is that what we are facing as media, it's not only this terrible distrust from readers and the problem of sustainability. We are also facing how governments, they are not doing directly their job in order to protect journalism and to guarantee information. So this is also part of the problem. And as I said before, maybe it's not sometimes very clear what governments are doing against press freedom, because we have sometimes the idea that press freedom only when a journalist can't be talk about her job, but there's a lot of ways of obstacle this.
Thanks, Tanya. I mean, I think it's been particularly important for us in the working group, and I know more broadly in the forum, to really ground things in the reality that we face, which is that we both have new problems, the rise of digital media, and the way in which a sort of early wave of naivete about what that would mean, I think, has given place to sort of given way to a hard-earned realism about the market impact, but also terrible harassment, in particular women, people of color, and other underprivileged communities are subject to. But of course, also, I think a really forceful reminder that while some of the problems that we face are new or newish, others are as old as society itself. It's the democratic recession, it's the concentration of corporate power, it's the fact that powerful people generally don't like to be held to account, that they are not above shutting people up if they can, who come after them, and that in all parts of the world, but perhaps some parts of the world more than others, the role both of government and many incumbent media organizations is perhaps more ambivalent than citizens might like it to be. It's one thing whether media organizations have the ability to really genuinely try to hold power to account when government throws around its weight. It's another whether they have the willingness to do so at the expense of other things. So I think it's striking here that we see, of course, really impressive examples of old established organizations doing this, both in rich countries and in less well-off countries. I'm sitting here in my office with a mock from the Hindu group in India, for example, an organization I respect greatly, but also, of course, really inspiring in Elizabeth's spirit of hope and optimism to see Animal Politico in Mexico, Daily Maverick in South Africa, and some of your peers around the world, Rappler in the Philippines, Scroll in the Quint in India, Mediapart in France, and others who've shown that they could do really high quality journalism to the highest editorial standards, while also finding new ways of getting it in front of citizens and building a business around it to retain their editorial independence from concentrated power, whether political or otherwise. We have a sort of a channel open for any questions from people who are listening to this, but in the absence of such questions, I think we might turn back to some of our existing panelists for some initial observations about how we might respond to some of these different challenges that we've discussed throughout the panel now. And I want to turn back first to Elizabeth, because your work has been path-breaking really on local in particular, which is such a central part of the challenge that we face, and also perhaps sometimes a little bit overlooked in discussions that can tend to sort of gravitate towards the large, well-known national and international brands and overlook a little bit the question of whether local communities are served by journalism today and ideally tomorrow the way that they deserve to. So Elizabeth, your thoughts on local?
Yeah, I think it's thank you, Rasmus, for that question. I think it's a really interesting time in local journalism because, as the sustainability model is shifting, I think the practice model of local service is also shifting. And so, communities are asking, like, how have we not been served by our local news outlets? What stories have been told? What stories haven't been told? And so I think, what we're seeing is a really fascinating and important reorientation on both the sustainability front in local and on the practice front, because there's a recognition that newsrooms have to be more responsive, have to be more reflective of their communities. And I think, there are sustainability implications of that. In the US, as Stilly knows, I've done a number of studies on membership, both in public media and in small digital outlets. And I think the membership, the kind of reader revenue model is really interesting because on the one hand, it can be a source of revenue. On the other hand, you can end up kind of super serving a very narrow audience. And so I think there's a real robust and important conversation happening at the local level about how service and sustainability can really work hand in hand. And interesting experimentation, but I think it's a work in progress.
Thanks. I mean, I think you touch on something that is particularly pertinent perhaps for local journalism, because it's so visible when journalists and news organizations are closer to the public that they serve, but is arguably in many countries perhaps a wider phenomenon, which is that I think it's sort of, without exaggerating much, you can probably summarize a fair amount of the history of journalism in countries where I have lived, Denmark, the UK, the US, and Germany, as being by white men, about white men, and for white men. And just sort of proceeding from the observation that not all of humanity looks like me or enjoy the privileges that I enjoy. Perhaps there is a reckoning that needs to happen there. And I think it's been an inspiration to see how journalists in the United States, but also many other countries, have really started to hold their own profession and industry to account for whether it has in fact lived up to its aspiration of serving the whole public. In the past and in the present, and given that it arguably has not, how it might do so in the future. This, I think, is urgent at the local level where the connection is so central, but also one that is of relevance even for the most august institutions.
Definitely. And, you know, that both sustainability and service hinge around these issues of trust. And that's where, you know, platform distribution, social media distribution is a harm to both the, you know, the trust on the sustainability front and then on the trust on the audience front. And so I think that helps explain in our working group how some of these issues felt so difficult to untangle, because at a certain level, you know, the trust crisis and the sustainability crisis are linked.
And yet at the same time, perhaps also not a response to one another, in the sense that if we look at some of the most profitable news organizations in the world, you know, I could think of Fox News in the US, which has a very large profit margin. At least in our research, they are not always the most highly or widely trusted organizations. And I think many journalists would perhaps not necessarily themselves hold them up as always being the most shining examples of seeking truth and reporting it to the highest editorial standards, whatever other qualities they might have, and their undeniable ability to bring in audiences notwithstanding.
Definitely.
But Julia, I think the funding point is obviously one key aspect of this, is really where we started the conversation as well. And it's an area where you've done a really essential work over the years. You have a new book out in French. You have your first book out in multiple languages. But what are your thoughts on some possible responses around the funding side of this problem?
I think on the funding side, you have two key questions. First of all is how do you want to allocate the funding? And the second key question is which media outlets can benefit from it? On the first point, I have worked over the past 2-3 years with the small groups of academics, Brian Knight in Bonn, Anya Schifrin in Columbia, Andrea Pratt also from Columbia, Guy Rolnick in Chicago, and others, with a proposal to introduce public funding for the media, and in particular to introduce public funding of the media in countries where it does not exist, the United States to begin with. And in the US, we really see that there is a huge media crisis that appear very clearly if you look at local news. Like in the middle of the US, in all the major cities now, you have local news desert with no longer any local newspapers nor local news websites. And I think that to solve this issue, we really need to introduce this public funding. So one of the things that we tried to understand was the opposition in the US to any public funding for the media, which is kind of strange if you think in historical terms, in particular because the US was in 1796, the very first country in the world to introduce public funding for the media. But now you have this strong opposition that is partly driven by the fact that people are afraid that public funding will be used as a policy tool by the government. And that's true that in some countries, for example, there is a lot of evidence on the case of Argentina. I'm working now on the case of India, where the government not only use public funding, but can also use advertising money to decide which media to finance depending on the content of the media. And so the solution we came with is what we called media vouchers. And what are these media vouchers? The idea is to say, okay, information is a public good. We need public funding. And the public funding can only come from the state. But we do not want the state to intervene. So let's give each citizen a media voucher of a certain amount, then he can allocate on an annual basis to the media outlets of his or her choice. And then we give a number of technical detail on how this allocation could work, and in particular how it could work very easily and could be implemented very quickly thanks to the tax administration. Now there is the issue of which are the media outlets that can benefit from it. And I have worked, so in my new book, so the title is pretty simple. The title is Information is a Public Good. But again, I think it's obvious to us, but it's useful to repeat it from times to times. And in this book, what we have done is that we have defined a number of principles that all the media outlets willing to get public funding should respect. And if you look at this principle, basically you have like 4 broad principles. The first one is to have democratic governance of the media, and in particular the fact of involving the journalists directly in the board of their media outlets. And it seems kind of crucial to me, given I think the journalists are the very best to defend their own independence. The second thing that can sound a little bit rare, but in fact has been implemented at a newspaper such as the daily newspaper Le Monde in France in recent years, which is a right of consent. So what does it mean? It means that as of today, the journalists of the newspaper Le Monde, if there is an ownership change, can vote on the new owner. And if they do not agree with the new owners, they have 3 months to find an alternative owner. And I think because media outlets are not like normal goods that should obey exactly the market rules, this possibility given to the journalist is really something key and should be a huge improvement compared to what is happening as of today in a number of countries. The third principle is really the issue of transparency, and I think we should have like much more transparency about who owns the media, and in particular not only the name of the owners, but where does it get its money from. And the last point, again, this sounds obvious, but it would be nice to see that in the law, is to say that you cannot have a media outlet without a journalist. And so if you want some public funding for information, you need to have some journalists. I think what we learned from what happened in Canada is that you cannot set an absolute number of journalists, because 5 journalists might not be enough for like big newspaper, while for like a small new media outlets, 1 or 2 can already be a lot. And so what we said is that you need to have at least 1/3 of your total revenues that are spent to fund for journalistic work. And I think these 4 principles, so the right of consent, democratic governance, transparency, and the fact of investing enough money in information, should be associated to the possibility of getting access to the fund. Nothing more, nothing about politics. You don't care whether the media are biased, because this is pluralism, and you really don't want like the government to decide a list ex ante. But you just want to be sure to only fund media outlets that can guarantee the independence of the journalistic work.
Thanks, Julia. The questions are beginning. I'll turn to our remaining panelists for a few more observations from us before we start opening up to field some of the questions. But I'm, delighted, Julia, to hear these very practical recommendations. And I think the last point in particular of your 4 principles is worth just stressing for those who are perhaps less familiar with media economics, that historically in many countries, in newspaper companies, something like 20% or so of revenues were invested in editorial, far more than in broadcasters, much more than in television broadcasters, but less, I would suspect, than what is the case at an organization like the Daily Maverick or Animal Politico, where I would expect that editorial and the newsroom make up for a much larger share. of total revenue. So it's interesting to think about not just the question of top lines, but also efficiency, if you will. How much journalism do we get for our bucks, crudely put? Tanya, I'm going to turn to you next, because I think this issue about transparency that Julia raised around how government advertising, for example, is allocated, this is an issue that you face quite urgently and know a lot about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how one might respond to that problem of transparency or even lack of transparency.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I think that transparency is the most important thing in order to actually understand what is happening with public resources on media. I mean, it's not illegal, it's not something wrong to have public resources on media, as Yula mentioned, but the thing is that in a lot of countries, we actually don't know how this money, these public resources are used. And it's not only, for example, to have the money in only one big group that now is publishing, for example, that everything is okay in one country with one government. When you have the rest of the press, the rest of the journalists being so critic with some issue, I mean, maybe the pandemic, for example. So we need, of course, law to manage with these public resources, but the law must be also very clear in how these public resources is used and why. You know, like, I mean, the media, it's the one that must have all the editorial power, all the editorial decisions in the use of this money. And it's something that sometimes didn't happen. I mean, in Mexico, we have a lot of cases of media that actually fully depend on public resources, on public advertisement. And it's very obvious. I mean, readers notice how the editorial line changes every time. And it is because of the money, you know. So I also think that, for example, the public media issue is something that also must be very transparent. How a public media actually works, all the resources that it receives, of course, and how the independence of this public media is guaranteed. You know, like, a public media never should be a media that actually works with the government or for the government. Like, you know, like, it's a public media, it's not the one that it's publishing all the activities of the government without doing journalism. And we have this practice also, it's very common in a lot of countries, you know. Here in Mexico, we have in public media, for example, the same show in 3-4 public medias on TV, digital, radio, and all saying, also repeating, only repeating what the president is saying, you know, without criticism or whatever, without journalism. That's it. So I think transparency, it's key in order to guarantee that public media, it's actually a public, and it's actually a public media, you know, but also to have control of over this public advertisement, that it's to maybe finance journalism, but it's not to control press. That's also very important. And finally, I think that in a lot of countries in the world, we also need, for example, transparency in over the rules that the government itself is putting, for example, to international fundings, international organizations. We are seeing how over the argument that they are international, for example, they don't have, they are a lot of obstacles in order to not operate funding media, you know, and the government, it's not clear. A lot of governments, they are not clear about these rules, how an international fund actually can operate in a country, or how they are breaking the law or something like that. Because over that, a lot of times it's only a way to control the funding from international organizations to the press in order to attack freedom of the press.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm going to turn back to Stilly for one part of the discussion that I think is perhaps particularly timely to have today, where in the last couple of days, both Facebook and Google's parent company Alphabet has released their first quarter results with huge growth in revenues. And of course, in a growing number of markets across the world, the majority of digital advertising go to a few large US-based platform companies, Google, Facebook, a growing share to Amazon, and in other countries, some of the mainland Chinese-based platform companies. And this has led some to suggest that either competition law has been developed in Australia or copyright has been developed in the European Union, or some version of these has been discussed in Canada, should be a central part to the funding of journalism going forward. You've spoken out on this issue yourself, and before I field a few of the questions that have come in from people who've been watching us, I wanted to get your take on this question of platform policy as the final intervention.
Yeah, thanks, Rasmus. It's my belief that news publishers do not have a divine right to advertising revenue. It's not something that is God-given to us, and they built a better advertising mousetrap than we ever could, and so kudos to them. But I think the thing we can legitimately complain about is that the playing fields haven't been leveled. Right, these big Silicon Valley behemoths don't pay tax in the countries where they generate this revenue. They're not responsible and accountable for the content on their platforms that is responsible for generating violence, genocide, distress at many different levels. And it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of effort to be accountable for that content, which we are. And so we pay tax on the odd occasion where we do make profits, and we're also accountable for the content that we publish. So if you're going to take the spoils for building a better advertising mousetrap, you should have the responsibilities that go with that as well. And I think that's the kind of level playing field, or a more level version of the playing field that we currently have. And I think when these organizations start paying tax in the countries where they generate that revenue, that money could go towards media diversity and development and innovation. And so I think there are better ways at addressing the platform challenge than some countries have taken, like in Australia, where we're not seeing, in my opinion, journalism or journalists benefit from the kinds of regulation that's been implemented there, but rather a couple of shareholders or owners, right? And so did the industry benefit from that? And I don't think that we can say the industry benefited, but rather a few individuals benefited from that. So I'd prefer to see something, a more sort of holistic approach to addressing the problem, which is getting that lost tax revenue back into the fiscus of each country, using that money in a way to stimulate innovation and media diversity, and then also holding the platforms to be accountable for the content that's published on their platforms.
Thanks very much, Stilly. I'm going to field a few of the questions that have come in for those who've taken the time to watch the panel today, and thanks very much for tuning into this. The first question comes from Claire Cook at International Media Support. And Elizabeth, I wonder whether you have a response to this. Claire asks, to what extent we feel we've been able to shed light on the barriers to entry for smaller independent publishers. For example, the cost associated with getting access to analytics or content management systems, or for that matter, content rights management systems and new forms of AI technology and the like. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. That's a great question. I think from a purely technical perspective, the cost of some of these technologies is pretty low. In the US, philanthropic funders led by the Knight Foundation have made huge investments in the kind of like technical infrastructure that can support new entrants. And then you see like Substack kind of getting into the local news game. So you're seeing the rise of like kind of single newsletters, one-person newsrooms. So I think from a sort of like content creation and distribution perspective, the barriers to entry have never been lower. Where I think we have more work to do is, on the distribution side, it's incredibly difficult to build a trusted digital news brand. And so figuring out how you bring those costs of audience development down, I think that's a huge issue. And then the other, at least in the US that I know of, is the sort of insurance issue, because you can start a newsroom, but it can be, you know, very, very costly and risky to be publishing content that holds power to account. And so I think there's, you know, there are some ancillary important services that have to do with insurance and you know, protecting humans who are doing the work, where the barriers are still very high.
I mean, I can't help but highlight here also the problem, as you allude to, of you know, rich and powerful individuals who try to use the legal system to sort of cower journalism into silence by threatening them with spurious lawsuits and the like, which is a particularly pronounced problem for small organizations who don't have access to the same kind of legal expertise as larger organizations do. But thanks, Claire, for the question. And it's one that we have looked at in our work, as Elizabeth suggested. I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that Nihat has a chance to sort of wrap us up. So maybe I will just say a few things from my side, including a response to one of the questions that's come in, which is what we'll do once the working group's report has been published. The report is from the Forum on Information and Democracy. We expect it'll be out in early June. And I suppose the way that I see the work that the Forum has done in this space around sustainability of journalism specifically is to identify a range of reality-based options that governments and elected officials can pursue if they believe that they are the right thing to do and they believe that it's in the public interest to do so, that have proof of concept, that are actually existing, if you will, and that are less polarizing than some of the other interesting ideas that might be out there that are also worth considering, but do come, I think, with some ancillary risks, as I suggested at the outset. In addition to being a sort of a menu of options for governments, should they decide that they actually want to do something rather than nothing, which has been the default in most cases, or worse than nothing, as is the case in many parts of the world. In addition to being a menu of options for governments, I think it's also important to think of the report as a document that enables all of us as citizens to think about how we hold government to account for whether they are actually doing something or whether they are happy to settle for sort of after-dinner speeches extolling the virtues of journalism in our democracies without actually doing anything to protect free expression, to protect media freedom, and to create an enabling environment for independent professional journalism. If I may say so, I think there's been a lot more talk than there's been action in this space. And there seems to be greater appetite in some parts of the world, either for sort of just outright hypocrisy, or at best sort of benign indifference, and of course in some cases just full-on hostility towards independent journalism. So governments can do some things, but I think it's also important we as citizens are equipped to hold our governments to account as to whether they are actually doing some of the things that are possible. How does one wrap up a conversation as rich and wide-ranging as this? I will say just a few things in closing before handing it over to Nihat to, again, connect this with the wider work of the Forum on Information and Democracy. And I suppose I can paraphrase W.E. Du Bois, the Black American journalist and scholar and internationalist, when I might suggest that perhaps we should measure the sustainability of journalism not by the number of media millionaires or the market capitalization of incumbent companies, but by the absence of underserved communities, broadly and equally informed citizenry, and whether power is in fact held to account, and by the number of people who can and do follow the news, the important news that independent professional journalists are best positioned to provide us with. With that, Nihat, I will hand it over to you to wrap us up. And thanks to all the panelists from my side for joining us today and for all your work in the working group.
Thanks again, Rasmus, and thank you to all the panelists for this great discussion. We have seen how crucial the sustainability of journalism is, and the situation, of course, varies depending on the country you are in. Hopefully there are means of concrete actions and solutions. On behalf of the forum, I'm really grateful for the work and the brilliant recommendations being developed by the working group on the sustainability of journalism. As you have already mentioned, we are entering the final phase of their development, and will be able to publish the full report in a bit more than a month. This will be a major tool for the countries of the international partnerships on information and democracy and beyond, to ensure the viability of journalism, and we are calling on them to take concrete actions. This report will also be a counterpiece of the forthcoming summit of the Initiative on Information and Democracy, which will be held in September on the margins of the UN General Assembly. We will provide states and other stakeholders with concrete actions that they can take to implement democratic safeguards in the information and communication, including the sustainability of journalism. We want to make civil society organizations an important actor in its preparation and in the summit itself. So I'm taking this opportunity to call every actor in the field to reach out to the Forum on Information and Democracy to work together in the implementation of the recommendations. While ending this and wrapping it up, I would also like to flag the participation of Christophe Delors, the chair of the forum and the Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders, to the plenary session on the viability of media tomorrow at noon. I hope you will be able to attend. Again, thank you everyone, and thanks a lot to UNESCO for hosting this session. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Neha.